So obviously carbohydrate supply determines on how fat is metabolized and used in that state within the body. Okay. And here this is simplistically representing how glucose may be converted to fat in the case of energy excess. So we've already really gone through this process in the previous module, and it does somewhat simplify this process a little bit. So glucose, we know, can be used for energy, or it can be changed into fat and stored. That's what we just discussed. But remember that the process of conversion from carbohydrate fragments here into a fatty acid, this is an irreversible process. If the tissues have sufficient energy, the fragments can be reassembled, not back into glucose, but into fatty acid chains. Okay. Now thinking about fat in the context of, I guess, overall health and cardiovascular health. So cardiovascular disease is the #1 cause of death in the United States, and it may be attributed by high intakes of saturated and trans fatty acids. More about trans fats in a moment. High intakes of refined carbohydrates, so diets high in simple and not complex carbohydrates and added sugars that are very easy to digest and absorb. So when these are oversupplied, they're likely converted to and stored as fat. So a diet high in refined carbohydrates usually results in a blood lipid profile that paints a picture of a higher risk of developing cardiovascular disease, i.e. high levels of bad cholesterol, LDL cholesterol, higher levels of total triglycerides, so total fat in the blood, lower levels of good cholesterol, i.e. HDL cholesterol. Cardiovascular disease was thought to be much more common in men, but over time our knowledge of this has changed, likely due to a shift in eating patterns within the Western world, combined with an increased incidence of obesity. So being a man is a risk factor, but it's not just a man's disease anymore. Okay, so it should be clear now that they need some more fat. We need fat in the diet, some fat but not too much, and ideally the right type of fat in an appropriate amount. So the type of fat is arguably as important as how much fat we were eating. Dietary fat supplies the essential fatty acids known as we've got here, linoleic acid. So linoleic acid, omega-6 acid, more about that in a second, and linolenic acid. So the first one, linoleic acid, and confusingly they do sound the same. Linoleic acid is referring to omega-6. So the omega carbon is actually referring to the final carbon at the end of the fatty acid chain. So not the carbon attached to the glycerol backbone, but the end carbon, the omega carbon. So omega-6 highlights that within this fatty acid, the first double bond, the first point of unsaturation, is located on the 6th carbon from the final end omega carbon. Okay, so that's how that is labelled and why it's called an omega-6 fatty acid. And then linolenic acid is omega-3, whereby the first double carbon is located on the 3rd carbon from the end omega carbon. So essential fatty acids are types of long chain fatty acids, typically 18 carbons or more, and they are polyunsaturated fatty acids, i.e. they have 2 or more points of unsaturation or double bonds. As we know from chapter 2, we're recommended to consume between 20 and 35% of total daily energy from fat, so that's the AMDR reference there as a form of DRI. And less than 10% of daily energy intake should be from saturated fat. And we should try and avoid trans fats altogether. So I'm just recapping on the advice we already know. However, in reality, US dietary fat intakes on average, according to research, are providing about 35% of total energy, and at least 11% of total energy is supplied from saturated fats, but it's likely much more than these figures. So continuing recommendations for fat intake. So we've been introduced to the concept of a Mediterranean diet in chapter 2 within nutrition tools as a form of an eating pattern. So really, in summary, a healthy Mediterranean-style diet consists of vegetables, fruits, legumes, nuts and seeds, whole grains, fish and other seafood, some cheese and yogurt, but very little red meat, very few added sugars, and ultimately no ultra-processed foods. So this eating pattern promotes consumption of fats from mostly avocados, extra virgin olive oil, olives, nuts and seeds. So it's therefore very rich in mono and more significantly polyunsaturated fats, including the essential fatty acids. It's also a diet very rich in phytochemicals, very low in saturated and trans fats. So this results in a more favourable blood lipid profile of the person consuming a Mediterranean diet, and the diet can be considered as cardioprotective, i.e. protective against cardiovascular disease. It can sometimes be described as an anti-inflammatory diet or an anti-inflammatory eating pattern for this reason. Excuse me. It's also important to avoid, moving on to the second point, a very low-fat diet. Obviously, a diet that supplies not enough fat, which is considered as less than 20% of total energy from fat, we know that can become over time detrimental to health. Okay, so the next two slides show the recommendations for fat intake in healthy people, most of which should already be familiar. So we know that the OMDR for the general population recommends between 20 and 35% of total energy be consumed from calories from fat. Regarding saturated fat specifically, there are a couple of references here. So the AHA advised for those adults who would benefit from LDL cholesterol reduction, so reduction in the bad type of blood cholesterol, they recommend reducing saturated fat intakes to provide a reduced percentage of calories between 5 and 6%, whereas the general DRI and also dietary guidance for Americans both advise consuming less than 10% of calories per day from saturated fats. So the AHA are advising an even stricter a guideline for this type of individual. Trans fats, so the AHA advise an overall reduction in calories from trans fats for people who benefit from LDL cholesterol reduction. And the dietary guidelines for Americans tell us just to limit them. We should really just be avoiding them in general. Okay. Regarding polyunsaturated fatty acids, so the DRIs have quite specific recommendations for each of the two essential fatty acids. So for linoleic acid, there are two types of recommendations. So a percentage of total calorie recommendation at 5 to 10%, and then they're also split by sex as well. For linoleic acid, it's the same. There is a percentage of total calorie recommendation and split by sex. You're not going to be expected to learn these off by heart. This is really just for your overall understanding and awareness. Okay. So in summary, the DRIs advise specific amounts, so either a percentage of total energy or grams per day intake for both of the essential fatty acids. And the dietary guidelines for Americans generally just tell us a healthy eating pattern includes oil, so they're not very specific. Finally, for cholesterol, so for dietary cholesterol, the DRIs advise us to minimise dietary cholesterol intake within the context of a healthy diet. However, when I was looking at this lecture, arguably this recommendation is out of date, since we now know that dietary cholesterol itself has not been shown to impact our blood lipid profile and therefore cardiovascular disease risk. It's actually saturated fat consumption that's associated with changes in blood LDL cholesterol levels and therefore changing cardiovascular risk. So no pun intended, but take this statement with a pinch of salt. Okay, so this is the final slide of today's lecture, figure 5.11. This shows us the sources of saturated fats found commonly within the US diet, according to this piece of research. The largest section is this green section here, depicted within the pie chart. It's labelled mixed dishes, and the box to the right of the chart expands this into subgroups, as you can see. So you can see that the majority of these mixed dishes could be labelled as fast or processed foods, so things like pizza, burgers and sandwiches. Also look at the segment labelled snacks and sweets. What colour is that? That's sort of a mauve colour here. Get the mouse. 18% of the total depicted within that category there. So the saturated fats contained within these foods are probably things like shortenings, palm oil, butter and butter substitutes. So just as some information there. This is the last slide for today's lecture. It might have been delivered quicker than normal in class because of how I'm delivering it. So feel free to listen again or to make notes in your own time. If you have any questions, feel free to email me. And I'm thinking of opening a discussion forum for each of the lectures I'm posting so that we can have a Q&A session just as we would in class. Okay, take care.